Okay, I realized that I accidentally messed up my recording software because I had my microphone muted for the whole thing. We're gonna do this really quickly. Basically, Neru is having trouble tanking with Rhino with his overguard, and this is actually something a lot of people struggle with, and a lot of people ask questions, and I see a lot of people try to build for Rhino's overguard to like make him scale. But the thing about building for it with like armor and shit is that like realistically the most dedicated like iron skin only builds where you put all of your stuff into iron skin, they really suck for tanking because they cap out at like 1 million to 2 million iron skin. I think the highest I've ever seen from like an iron skin only build was like 3 million, whereas like I personally have gotten like 10 million just going to level cap. So like obviously it scales, right? But the strategy is really simple, right? So when you cast Iron Skin initially, the issue that a lot of people run into is that it pretty much depletes as quickly as it builds. So you see here it built up and then it's gone. And then I press it again and then it's going to build up and then it's just going to vanish, right? And this is the issue that Neru is running into very frequently. It builds up and then it vanishes right away. But the key is that after it builds up, you need to add movement to the mix. And you'll see that even though it is depleting, and it is still depleting, it's depleting very quickly, it's depleting infinitely slower than it was when I was just standing there. And that's because enemy damage is guaranteed, but enemy accuracy is really low and really small. You can stall even further and even harder by using your stomp as a CC tool, the way it's intended to be used. And you can see that I absorbed a lot less damage here because there's just less enemies shooting at me. I actually did really bad timing. Typically, you want to stomp right about after you've casted the Iron Skin, but you can see it's just a matter of like adding movement to the mix, because once you are moving and taking cover and moving dynamically, and then you throw a stomp in there, you can just see how much slower it depletes. The damage is guaranteed, but because you can change the accuracy with movement, you can reduce the amount of damage you're absorbing significantly. And this matters because Iron Skin is one of the only forms of scaling in the game that is based off of enemy damage, meaning that it will always be relevant, basically. The amount of damage you absorb and the amount of damage you take dynamically through movement will always be in this same ratio. These can be level 50 enemies, these can be level 500 billion enemies. And the difference between standing still like this and moving around is night and day. You can kind of think of Rhino's Overguard less as a health bar and more as a timer. And you can stall this timer by adding movement to the mix rather than thinking of it like a number that's going down. What a lot of players will struggle with is they will basically build up a really small amount of Overguard and a small Iron Skin from like a single enemy, and then they'll run into a bigger group of enemies that will just pop it instantly. Dynamically in mission, this can happen a lot of times if you're doing a disruption mission, because you run out, you kill the Demolist, and then there's not really that many enemies that are on the way to the Demolist, so by the time you get back to the main horde, you don't have that much Overguard built up, and then when you get to the main horde, you're dealing with the fact that it's going to pop really quickly or really instantly. The main thing is that when your Overguard breaks for that first time, you can see here I've done this setup where I had one enemy build up the Overguard, and I've got all these guys shooting at me, and it's just depleting too fast. It's like, it's not, the Overguard wasn't really a big enough number. The solution is just to let the cluster of enemies break and then reset your Overguard and get that bigger number from that horde that instantly popped it. You can't panic when it gets popped. You can't like freak out unless you're actually like out of energy. Like, if it's at that point where you're like, oh my god, I'm going to explode, I'm going to die, then that's when you have to, like, try and pay attention. But you can see that, like, as soon as I face the horde that instantly popped the Overguard, just casting it again is good enough to get me a large enough health buffer to start playing again. Logistically, it's kind of hard to turn a number that you see on screen into a timer, because the number that you see on screen and the amount of time it buys you is actually different than the number that shows up on screen. You know, you get the same amount of time from 4,000 overguard that you do from 80,000 overguard. So it really is just kind of game sense and awareness. But hopefully this helped you. Hopefully this makes sense to you. Hopefully it makes sense to Naru. Yeah, that's about it. Goodbye.